Alrighty, hi everyone.
Hello.
Everyone. Hi. Can we go around and do a quick round of introductions so I know who I'm talking to?
I'm a junior at
Hi,
Sept.
Keith.
I'm Maya. I'm a senior here at Sept University.
I'm Madeline. I'm a grad student at WashU.
This is Ata Mohammed, if you remember me.
I do, you're my other Mustafa.
Yes. So right now, I'm going to grad school too for public policy. So I hope to see you again when you're back in office. I'll contact you regarding the rest of the stuff that I'm doing over there.
Okay.
Yep.
Vincent, undergrad with Webster U.
Awesome.
Mustafa.
I thought there might be someone over there, but I was not sure.
You guys can
I go to Harris Stowe and I graduate this December. And hopefully grad school afterwards.
Congratulations. Sounds like some of you are nearing the end or in that period of, oh my God, what do I do next? I am still there. Life just continues that way. Sorry. So anyway, my name is Sara Baker. I'm the Legislative and Policy Director with the ACLU of Missouri. I'm coming up on my 2-year anniversary here in October. Actually, October 17th, I believe. I started on my birthday, so I would forever remember it. That is where I got my start with the ACLU. So going through your PowerPoint, I'm going to be super informal about this. If you have questions, please feel free to interrupt, interject, contradict me. I love banter, so happy to engage in a conversation with you all. I'll read the origin story about the speaker in very brief detail. So I got my start at WashU, actually, right after graduation. I was the coordinator of international programming. So if you know the honorary SIR, Sigma Iota Rho, I worked a lot with them on doing programming from around the country and around the globe to bring it to WashU's campus. I kind of got my start doing organizing work when I was a fellow for the American Association of University Women in DC. And then when I came back to St. Louis, I also worked with the International Institute, worked with WashU, and then decided that I would do my master's in international affairs at WashU at the same time as I was working for them, because those tuition programs are prime, and you should definitely capitalize on that if you ever work for a university. Then after WashU, when I was completing my master's thesis, I started a project for the Defense Intelligence Agency on civil, basically transition and leadership transition in Cuba. And so because I had done that project and I worked with an excellent professor there named Susan Craig, then I was asked to come to the Defense Intelligence Agency in DC and do presenting both there and around the globe through satellite to various folks within the Defense Intelligence Agency. That led to a job offer from them, but of course I had to pen security clearance. When you're going for security clearance, it is very important you remember this one key fact. Do not marry the love of your life who happens to be Russian at the time. That really slowed down things as far as my security clearance. So I took a job for the Center for Democracy in the Americas, which as someone who's not a big fan of saying that we should export our type of government everywhere, that was an odd title for me to take. But I worked as a fellow for the Center for Democracy in the Americas, basically doing congressional delegations between the U.S. and Cuba. Got to go to Cuba several times with congressional delegations. Got to sort of see Cuba changing, but at the same time, the resistance to change there and the well-deserved, sort of passion that folks in Cuba have for their country and for their way of life. So did that for CDA, then decided I no longer wanted to work for CDA, so I came back to St. Louis. I was about to get married at the time, and I started doing the kind of the 51st dates of the advocacy community, stumbled into a meeting with Jeffrey Mittman that I did not know was going to be an interview, and then ended up getting offered the job as a policy director at the same time as I got my security clearance in DC. So I had to choose my path between light and dark, and I went with the ACLU, and I could not be happier. It's been a wonderful fit ever since then, and I'm so glad that you all are also on the team, and I hope it's as fulfilling for each and every one of you as it has been for me. Any questions about the origin? Okay, great. So let's get into the actual meat of the workshop. We're going to talk today about lobbying. I'm sure you all know something about lobbying thanks to the seminal film, Thank You for Smoking. But lobbying is prolific throughout the United States and in some other places as well. And it was one thing that I never really saw myself being, but here we are. I am a lobbyist, right? I'm the lobbyist for the ACLU. So I'm not going to read through these agenda pages because I know we're a little short on time. But the biggest thing that I want you to get out of this workshop is really what is the ACLU's approach to lobbying and why are we in this public policy space? So if I haven't made that clear to you by the end of this presentation, make sure you ask me that question because I think it's the most important part of what we're doing here today. Okay, so this presentation, full disclosure, one of your fellows put it together for me. Maeve put it together and included a lovely bit about the history of lobbying. I learned some things that I did not know before about lobbying, but it's kind of one of the oldest traditions, right? You want to know how you can persuade someone to take up your viewpoint. We've experienced this with our friends, we've experienced it with our significant others, with our bosses. Lobbying is about persuasion. And at the ACLU, lobbying is about persuasion based on the Constitution and convincing someone that the actions they take should uphold the spirit of the Constitution. So while lobbying had its origin way back in the 1500s, the modern day conception of it is in some ways very different and in other ways quite similar. You'll see in the historical document or the documentation that Maeve provided here that he talks about lobbying in the sense of something you did in a lobby. That's still the way it is in Jefferson City. So we call it under the dome. When you go into Jefferson City, you'll see the state Capitol dome. It wants to look like the U.S. Capitol building. In reality, it looks like the U.S. Capitol building, but like with a few sandstorm issues, some erosion, and maybe a little bit falling down and some mold in the basement. So don't have this idea of grandeur. But when we say lobbying, we often say it's what happens under the dome. And the reason for that is the two chambers are set up in such a way that they're facing the lobby, the third floor rotunda, where all the lobbyists sit. So the first thing I was told when I go to Jefferson City is if you need to find anyone, meet them on the third floor rotunda. Because that's really where all the moving and shaking is done. You can pull legislators off the floor and talk to them really quickly, and then talk to other lobbyists. The lobbying that we do and the lobbying that most people do to be effective is not just we, the ACLU, talk to the legislature. It's we, the ACLU, talk to our coalition members. We talk to organizations that vehemently disagree with us on some issues but happen to agree with us on this. We talk to other government officials who might be able to influence the government official that we're trying to work with on a particular piece of legislation. So don't think of lobbying as just the hierarchical lobbyist to legislator. Think of it as something that goes upwards, downwards, sideways. It's all over the place because it's really about connecting people and making sure that you are power mapping in a way that makes you effective. So when I look at a legislator, I don't just say, I need to convince this person. It's I need to convince their network because that's how I get support for the decision that I'm hoping that they'll make. So Maeve also included a definition of lobbying. I think that that's a pretty good definition, but I think in practice, the core of lobbying is about forming relationships and networks that support the movement you're trying to make. Often it's done with an individual, but more and more it's done in a network to try to move statewide legislation and even to move city legislation and certainly to move federal legislation. Any lobbyist who tells you, I did that myself, is lying to you. Because there are so many other people in the room who make things like this possible. So, for example, last year when we were able to assist in getting maternal shackling removed at Department of Corrections facilities, that was not an effort that we did by ourselves. It was an effort that came from coalition partners, from multiple legislators, from passionate people on the outside. So lobbying is really about forming that network of individuals that's gonna support your decision and help you move the individual if you need to move. Okay, moving on to interest groups. So there are some well-funded lobbyists in Missouri, and certainly there are well-funded lobbyists at the federal level. The best off, or the ones who tend to have the most power, come from business interest groups, in particular in Missouri. So you'll see like chambers of commerce are very effective in their lobbying tactics, a lot of times because they have businesses that are in the district that the representatives are electing. You'll also see, statewide chambers of commerce who can pull on resources from Baldwin, as well as they can pull on resources from Kansas City and say, this is where the business community as a whole. Interest groups can be very powerful because they don't speak for one person, they speak for one group. What I found often as a lobbyist, though, is one strategy when you're kind of the small voice in the room in terms of the ACLU has never been the one who could show up really with the resources, right? We come in with our briefcase full of good ideas and our heart full of idealism, and we don't necessarily come in and say, this could have electoral consequences for you. What I've noticed about interest groups is they often come in with a lot of that assumed power. So folks will think, oh, because you represent, all Missouri agricultural businesses, that you carry a lot of weight because you have interest in every single district. Often as a lobbyist, another thing that I'll do is try to peel off members of interest groups to make folks realize that those groups are not as homogenous as originally thought. So interest groups are a big part of lobbying, but lobbying the interest groups is also a big part of lobbying. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I'm getting some nods. Okay. Let's get to the role of the ACLU, my favorite. So the ACLU really has a myriad of different ways that they'll attack a problem, and this is one of the reasons that I found it absolutely fascinating to work at the ACLU. I kind of view myself being horrible about sports metaphors, so recognize this isn't going to go a great direction, but I kind of view myself as a goalkeeper before our legal department, right? So when we have something that is at the legislature and is clearly unconstitutional, it is my job to fight as hard as possible to make sure that legislation doesn't go across the line, because we don't want to have to sue about it. We don't want the impact to negatively affect people's civil liberties. So I'm basically standing in front of the Missouri legislature saying, roughly 700 things that you're trying to do are likely unconstitutional. Let's try to block them, okay? And certainly some are gonna slip by. There are I don't wanna go super into the legislative process, but there are a lot of places for opportunity and failure along the way, probably over 20, 25 for each bill. So there's a lot of goalkeeping that happens. But the ACLU is fascinating because you have that political arm that can say, we're goalkeeping at the state capitol, we're pushing initiatives that we care about that would better defend civil liberties, and we're protecting against initiatives that might impinge on civil liberties. So there's that exciting aspect of it from the political sense. There's also a new area to the ACLU that I'm sure you all are growing more familiar with, which is mobilization. So after the election of Donald Trump, we had a huge uptick in our volunteer base, and not just our volunteer base in the cities, although predominantly, but we're really trying to expand that political force in an effort to bolster some of our lobbying work as well. So if we can show that the ACLU has political power in places ranging from Butler County in the south of the state to Kansas City to St. Louis, then we're more influential in the state legislature, knowing that most legislators, or a wide array of legislators, come from areas that are more outstate. And so one way that we increase our ability to lobby is by increasing political power in strategic districts throughout the state. So we have that as our political arm. So it's both this advocacy element, this lobbying element, and this mobilization element. And then you have what is more traditionally the ACLU's work, which is the legal department. How those two interplay, I think, is super fascinating because that's not the normal interaction. I think the ACLU started out as a group, well, I know this, I don't think this. The ACLU started out as a public interest law firm. It's a legacy that we're proud to uphold. But when we add more components to our program, when we add political advocacy, we're able to stop a lot of things before they have the negative consequence. But we're also able to say, our opinion really matters because see what happened when you passed that piece of legislation. You got sued exactly the day that that legislation was going to go into effect. So what I find fascinating about our lobbying effort in particular is we're a double-edged sword. If you don't, sort of recognize the ACLU's position in the beginning, you often are going to end up with litigation. And so there's always that back and forth. And a lot of legislators fear getting sued by an organization like the ACLU. So that gives us some leverage in the state capitol as well. ACLU approach, though, is unique for several reasons that are listed out here. But the one I want to highlight is our policy 519, which is that we will never endorse a political candidate, and we are a nonpartisan organization. You might want to ask a lot of questions about that later. I'm happy to take them, but that's incredibly important to realize about our lobbying effort as well. Because when we're lobbying, we're not saying we're here as, libertarians to argue for a specific point. We're saying, irregardless of party, we're going to make points for civil liberties. We did this under the Obama administration. We'll continue doing it under the Trump administration. This has nothing to do with losing power. In Missouri, we did it under the Nixon administration. We did it under the Greitens administration. We'll do it under the Parsons administration. So it's irrespective of party, which is a little bit different, I think, from other organizations who do lobbying, who might get to sit out a session, right? We don't get to do that. It's always on fire in Missouri. So our issues. We have a wide array of issues, and I'm sure there are different things that brought you to the ACLU. Let's popcorn around the room real quick. What is the one issue that made you want to work for the ACLU? Let's start with the same person who went first on me.
For me, it was the criminal justice system and criminal justice reform.
Okay.
My minor is in social justice.
I don't actually work here, but I'm super passionate about racial justice and criminal justice reform.
For me, it's racial justice and immigration.
Mine was them standing up to the police,
Brutality.
brutality and authority of, the situations going on with the police department in Missouri. All over.
Absolutely.
Me, I pretty much anything that has to do with people. Anything that people go against other people. I mean, I don't know, civil rights, anything.
Okay. So it should come as not a shocker at all that these are issues that the ACLU works on under the dome in the same way that we work on in the legal department. So just going through a couple of things that you all laid out. On racial justice, we have for several years supported the Fourth Amendment Affirmation Act, which is about making sure that the data collected on racial profiling, which shows and has shown for almost 20 years that we have a horrible problem with racial profiling in the state of Missouri, has actual consequences. We believe that departments that continue to racially profile should face financial consequences for that profiling, should face discipline for their officers, and should possibly face, additional training and things like that as well to bring the department up to stuff. So we've worked on sponsoring legislation like that for several years now. On criminal justice reform, we're working to put together a package right now about readdressing mandatory minimums and marijuana prosecutions throughout the state of Missouri, and making sure that the reforms put in place with Senate Bill 5, which basically changed how Missouri regards fines and fees so that you don't end up in jail just because of a parking ticket you weren't able to pay. We're making sure that those reforms do not get repealed. On police accountability, I point to the Fourth Amendment Affirmation Act, but I also point to all of our work on civil asset forfeiture. So we assist with a bill under the dome that would basically say, if you're a police department and you seize assets, so if someone pulls you over and you have $100,000 in your car and they seize those assets because they think that they might be involved in some sort of drug crime, guess what? Even if the police department is working with a federal task force, we don't believe that they should get that money back to fund the department. We think that that money should go, as Missouri law stipulates, through a due process procedure with the individual first, and then if that comes out disfavorably for the individual, then it should go into education, as Missouri law is designed to do. We don't believe in having kickbacks for police departments that misuse civil asset forfeiture. And we also want to expand the use of body cameras and make sure that police are held accountable for their actions. We do that both in the legislative department and in the legal department. And then voting rights. We're part of a huge voting rights coalition throughout the state that fought tooth and nail not to have not to have voter ID go into effect. We also fought against real ID, but for different reasons. So not to have voter ID go into effect because we knew it would disenfranchise people throughout Missouri. So those are some of the issues that we lobby on. Other issues include women's reproductive rights. We consistently confront roughly 30 anti-choice bills in the Missouri legislature every year. We have a program dedicated to LGBT rights, the Transgender Education and Advocacy Program. We consistently fight for MONA, the Missouri Non-Discrimination Act, to be put into place so that our LGBT neighbors are protected when it comes to housing, employment, and public accommodations. We also work, and this is kind of a unique niche for the ACLU, there's really no one else who lobbies on this, as First Amendment issues. We make sure that your right to protest is protected. We do that both in the legislative realm and, of course, with cases like the Stockley case in the city of St. Louis. And on immigration, we are part of the table, and hopefully a growing and more substantial table in the future, who fight for immigrant rights in the state of Missouri. This past session, the Missouri legislature wanted to redraw redistricting lines so that they didn't have to count non-citizen residents, which would basically mean that there would be less representation in areas where immigrants live, but not less people where immigrants live. And I think it makes a pretty good degree of sense to recognize that just because you give these folks, give those communities less representation does not mean that those communities don't need similar resources or the same resources. Everyone's gonna drive on the same roads, everyone's gonna go to the same schools. So really that was just an attempt to pull resources away from communities that have been open and welcoming towards the immigrant community as well. So we fight against those types of issues every single year. This past year, we tracked roughly 700 pieces of legislation. We testified roughly 100 times. Happy to answer questions about the legislative process if those numbers seem weird to you. And ultimately we were fairly successful in our legislative efforts. We got two things across the line this year: raise the age and the anti-maternal shackling bill. But as I said before, we did not do that alone. There were wide coalitions that helped with those efforts. Okay, I think we have gone over enough of the lesson one wrap up, so I will skip past that. Oh, now we're going into our image problem. I'm on the cartoon page. So when I saw this, I kind of laughed out loud because it was like, Maeve, you've never met me. How dare you portray me this way? But anyway, lobbying has an odd connotation to it. When I first heard that I was going to be a lobbyist, I thought that that was really quite the dirty word. And then I met a bunch of other lobbyists in the Dome and recognized that really what I was doing was just being a principled advocate in a political space for the views that this organization holds. Lobbying has this impression of lobbyists sort of greasing the wheels and giving money and making and kind of whining and dining legislators. It's not always like that. One of my favorite things that a legislator said to me, she was asking if I wanted to come to this event with her, and it was an event where it could definitely be construed as not one you're supposed to bring a lobbyist to, right? And she goes, well, you're not a lobbyist. You're a white hat lobbyist. So I was like, okay, that's a little bit different. But what she meant was like the Olivia Pope illusion, except I'm not a fixer. But it was a situation where she was saying, there are those on the lobbying side who really aren't resourced up to do the greasing the wheels. We aren't, participating in a process that is corrupting. We're instead trying to advocate for a process that's more transparent, but also gets across the viewpoints of our constituents, which are our members, which are the people who stand for civil liberties in the state of Missouri. So there's definitely a distinction between the lobbyists under the Dome that, sort of do participate in the games that are a little more on the side of something you might construe from Thank You for Smoking, and those who are really just advocates who are there doing this kind of lobbying work. And I wouldn't say necessarily that one is so much more influential than another, because it's truly about the relationships you're able to form under the Dome. And we have a lot of legislators there who do not like the idea that they would be persuaded by money. It's more about making sure that the best policy gets into effect. And I know that sounds idealistic when we look at government and we think government is largely bloated or corrupt or not doing what we want it to do. There are still people who are desperately fighting to do the right thing, and those exist on both sides of the aisle. And so it's sort of about finding your cohort that you fit in with in the Dome, and often the interest group is not necessarily going to have more influence if you're able to form those relationships. Okay, next we have this long example about the NRA. I'm not going to talk a ton about the NRA or Abramoff. I'll largely skip over that unless you have a lot of questions about it. It all falls under the sphere of the image of lobbying as a very negative one. What I think is interesting about the NRA comparison here is, I don't know if you all have listened to the recent podcast on the Daily with Anthony Romero about the ACLU and the comparison to the NRA. Does anyone listen to that? Okay. Really, it doesn't so much mobilization sphere, that's a little bit more what we're talking about, of we want people to consider themselves civil libertarians. So it's not that there are values shared between those organizations. It's more that when someone says they're a member of the NRA, they mean it sort of to their core. And what the ACLU is trying to cultivate is also that impression through our electoral work, through our lobbying work, and through our legal group work, that when we say we the people, we mean the people who are standing up for civil liberties in the streets. So when we're talking about interest groups like the NRA and we say, the NRA has so much influence, what's fascinating, I think, about that comparison is the influence that we're trying to gain is really in the hearts of people to support the values that the ACLU does, and that ultimately gives us more political power and ability to be influential in our work in a really grassroots level. So I'm not going to go too much into the funding elements of the NRA or Vermont's time in jail. I don't think it applies as much to what the ACLU has been doing. Over to career as a lobbyist. So a career as a lobbyist, I think I've given you a pretty good overview of what this is, but I want to talk a little bit about what the daily life looks like. So for my position, I technically live in Kansas City, but for 5 months of the year I live in Jefferson City, and roughly 2 times a month I'm back in St. Louis. So the life of a lobbyist looks like someone who's on the road. When people ask me where I live, I say I-70. And that's pretty true for every lobbyist that I know, because you're constantly crisscrossing the state to make all those connections. So on a typical day, if I'm not traveling, I'm communicating with people who I've worked with in the past, legislators, reaching out to new ones, trying to establish new relationships, and also doing a lot of drafting on bills and research to make sure that our policy position will make sense when we come to the legislature. Lobbying does not start the day that session starts. So session will start like second week of January this year. We will have already had all of our bills filed. We will know sort of what we're walking into. Those relationships are something that are forged way in advance. It's not something that you go in under the dome and you say, I want you to help me with this bill. It's almost too late from the day that session starts. So in the off session, what I'm doing is cultivating those relationships, drafting bills, and getting them ready to go for filing. When you're actually there under the dome, committee hearings start as early as 8 a.m. And can go to as late as 2 a.m. It just depends on what particular bill you're there to lobby on. The ones that tend to be held super late at night are the most controversial bills. Guess what? The ACLU lobbies on a lot of controversial bills. So if they're trying to do something where they're taking away rights from women, they do that under the cloak of night. If they're trying to take away rights from LGBT people, they generally do that under the cloak of night. And so we are there until the dawn to make sure that we're representing the views of the ACLU and making sure that we've done our very best to stop those pernicious efforts from going into effect. On a typical day in Jeff City, I'll testify probably about 3 times. Testimony, we provide written and verbal testimony, so I will go in, I will just put my written testimony down, and then I'll speak for about 2 minutes on the position of the ACLU and then take questions from the whole committee. Outside of that time, I'm pulling people off the floor and talking to them about specific bills of interest to them, or things I'm hoping we can stop together, or pulling in other coalition partners to say, hey, what did you hear from X representative? Do you think we could do this? It's a lot of talking. At the end of the day, I'm your least social person. So if you catch me on a good day leaving the dome around 7, no more talking. Like, that is the time for going back, doing research, and eating something. Because that's not something you get to do very frequently under the dome. That might make the career sound really unappealing. I don't know how much any of you would like doing some of that. I would say that where a career as a lobbyist, particularly in this field, becomes really fulfilling is the things that you manage to get across the line and the inspiring people that you get to work with. I know that sounds a bit like a cliche, but when you walk in and recognize that when you know the backstory to a bunch of bills and you know exactly what that person put on the line to help you better protect civil liberties, it's really humbling to watch in process. So that I would encapsulate as the career as a lobbyist. Oh, lobbying process. Well, we went through a little bit of that. Just super briefly, bills get introduced, they get a committee hearing, they go to the rules committee, they come to the floor, get a protection vote, they get a third read vote, they head over to the other chamber, same thing happens over there, then they get a third read and final passage vote. This is all if, they get a truly agreed and finally passed vote. This is all if there were no amendments or any shenanigans on the floor. The frequency with which that happens and the way I just laid it out for you is like something smooth and linear is zero. That never happens. There are always bumps along the road. There are always sort of sneaky things that get snuck in there at the last minute. There are personalities that come into play that want to hold legislation in order to get one of their bills passed. And so all of that kind of interrupts the process, and you as a lobbyist have to stay really on top of it to make sure that you know where bills are and you know mostly where the people themselves are, because that matters more than the actual process. The process is something that as a lobbyist you need to get to know super well, because you can make it work for you and it can work against you. So if you don't know, for example, that a bill has to sit in this committee for 24 hours before it's brought up, then you might do something that wouldn't be as effective as if you waited until the 22nd hour. So there's a lot of learning that process to make sure that your lobbying efforts are the most effective possible. If we're gonna try to get a bill to run in the legislature, we're working directly with community members and coalition partners months in advance, if not years in advance, before we're actually introducing a piece of legislation. And then when the community has a bill that they're thinking, yes, we've got the appropriate buy-in on, then we start negotiating with the legislators to see who's interested, to see who might want to take it up, to see who wants to champion the issue, and it becomes their bill. They make the changes to it. Often we're asked for consultation on drafting, we're asked to gather people to come and testify, but once it goes from our hands as a draft into their hands, it becomes their bill, and we sort of have to fight for its preservation along the way and make sure that we're helping and being helpful and maneuvering it to passage. Role of lobbying. Okay, so I'll go into role of lobbying a little bit, because I know I mentioned community members in bill drafting, but I want to kind of draw out that importance for the ACLU. So when we go and approach a specific issue, we're always looking for direct impact. And we hear about a lot of things through our legal department, in fact. Like a lot of the bills that we choose to sponsor come about because we've heard complaints to the legal department, or we've found on national trends that this is a problem, and so then that's when we sort of activate. But when we activate, we're not saying the ACLU knows best. That is not really worthwhile, because doing something alone is not impactful at the state legislature, federal, or even city level. So what we do when we have an issue that we deeply care about is go directly to the community and get input. And this is where I feel like there is a connection between lobbying and the democratic process. It is a double-edged sword though, right? There are organizations like ours that try to get into the community and try to bring those opinions and views to the state legislature. Maybe there's a triple-edged sword here. We try to do that, we sometimes fail to do that, right? So if we fail to do that and we bring something forward that doesn't have enough community buy-in, then ultimately our legislation will probably fail, but then we also haven't been as representative as we could have or wanted to. So there's us falling short of our own aspirations sometimes. Other times it's more of a direct conduit, I think, for the democratic process, because you're trying to use the resources of the ACLU to bring forward the civil liberties values of the people and make sure that those are upheld at the state legislature. Then there's the other side of lobbying, which can be to shut out the democratic process, right? I think that a lot of people feel like they do not have access or influence with their legislators, specifically because of lobbying and because of interest groups, and that's highly problematic. I think it increases the importance of organizations like our own that try to be more directly democratic, but it's the other side of lobbying as well. So I don't want to paint this as always a really positive feature for democracy. It definitely can block democracy too. And I think our job is to make sure that the so-called white hat lobbyists ultimately prevail in the end, and that we get the people to come to their government and the government to be more responsive to their people. It can really work both ways though, and like I said before, when you have those large interest groups that will ultimately say something like, we oppose MONA, what you have to do is then go directly to those interest groups and start peeling off their support. So if I know that a company within that overall interest group has been supporting Pride for years, and yet this interest group is saying we don't want Mona, then it's again the people's power to go and sort of destroy that coalition, to say, no, you company will take a stand independently of this organization and show support for this issue. And in that way, the people can move the lobbyists too. It happens sometimes. It doesn't always happen in a really beautiful way, and sometimes there's a lot of protest and direct sort of actions that have to take place to make sure that the people's voices get heard. But I think there is a way through the system of lobbying to help people be heard. I think we have to do better and better and better in making sure that democracy is more directly representative, and I don't think we need as many middlemen. However, I will also say in Jefferson City, the lobbyists are the ones who've been around the longest, and they actually know how the building works and how the legislative process works. And so there is kind of this crutch that happens in Jeff City where folks will rely on lobbyists to make sure that they're, sort of within the system for how bills are supposed to work and things like that, because there's that institutional knowledge. So all I'm trying to say there, and I know this is coming across confusing, is there is an aspect of lobbying that tries to be representative. There is an equal and sometimes even greater opposing force that blocks that from happening. So if you ever become a lobbyist, I hope you'll fight for getting more community voices in there. Okay. Oh, I guess what I was alluding to was what Mays would call ethical lobbying. Be ethical. All right. I don't think that I need to go over so much as a summary document, because I'd rather just take your questions and see if there's anything I can answer for you about this presentation or about our lobbying work overall or anything else that might be on your mind.
I have a question. So when you're talking to the community and drafting a bill, do you ever rely on outside research or anything like that to kind of decide what would be best to fix the problem you're facing?
So the ACLU is really lucky in that we work very closely with our national organization, and our national organization has a lot of research capacity. So we are able to pull in resources to say, hey, this worked really well in San Antonio. Hey, this worked really well in Philly. And we can share some of those sort of models. But we don't. So there are some lobbying groups that will just take a model bill and sort of run with it, right? And say, like, this is the solution to this problem. That's not really how I approach lobbying in Missouri, because I don't think that you can take a bill that worked in Illinois and say it will necessarily work in Missouri. The systems of government are a bit different. And so without that conversation, both with community members and with government officials, you don't get a bill that works for Missouri. So we might have an idea of we think ending cash bail is the way to go, and here's the system that they put into place in New Jersey, and what can we do here in Missouri? But we would never say, here's the system in Missouri, let's apply, or in New Jersey, let's apply it directly to Missouri. In part because that, to me, takes a lot more effort. I mean, lobbying is already hard, but if you get something that has so many flaws to it because it's not well thought out in the Missouri context, then you end up in this never-ending cycle of amendment, substitution, et cetera, and you don't get your legislation across the line. It can be a starting point if you're blocked, but I don't think it's the ultimately successful route to go.
This might be a stupid question. Where did they get the ideas to create bills up in Jefferson City with the legislature? Where do the ideas come from?
Yeah, well, it's a mix. That's not a stupid question at all. It's a total mix. Some people come in and they know what issue they want to work on, and they go, the legislators in Jeff City have a research staff. So once you become a legislator, you get access to that staff. And you could say, I have an idea. I want to increase police accountability, okay? And so you'll go to the research staff and you'll discuss some ideas for how you might do that. And then the research staff will help you with drafting. That's one way it can happen. Other legislators come in with a background like they've been in city government before that enables them to know how to do some of their own drafting. And so they'll come in with something already written. It'll be something they've thought of that they brought from their community. I have heard of constituents bringing bills to legislators and saying, I want you to sponsor this. This is important to me. This is important to your community. Lobbyist groups will bring bills and say, this is important to us. We want you to sponsor it and be good for your community. Sometimes legislators will find, Google does not elude the legislators, okay? So sometimes legislators will find things online that look like model legislation in other states that they'll pull into Missouri. One of the really fascinating things that I've been working on as a kind of side project is doing a bill comparison, so you can see where a bill pops up in Missouri. This generally happens on LGBT issues, and it's 80% similar to a bill that popped up in Montana or to a bill that popped up in Texas. And then you can kind of trace that back to which interest group is actually sponsoring that piece of legislation, and so that can give you some additional insight. I would say the majority of bills are ideas that the legislator had or thought that they might want to support, and then interest groups, lobbyists, constituents, et cetera, have capitalized on those ideas. So if I know that someone is really interested in like telecommunications, then I, as a telecommunications firm, is going to say, I should really go talk to that legislator about this thing that I would like to see changed.
So in your opinion, corporations have more power over lawmakers, that's what you're telling?
Then who?
Than the public, period. You think they have more
I think-
influence over decisions or laws that have been created or bills that are supposed to be passed? You think they have more influence?
Like I said, I think it can go both ways, because corporations are also vulnerable in ways that they don't often acknowledge. So for example, if I know that a rental car company is blocking an equality measure, or a local distillery is blocking an equality measure, I can blast out to my people as an advocate and say, boycott XYZ because they stand for discrimination. It's like in, when it came to the bathroom bill in North Carolina, where it was companies actually had pressure put on them to say, we will not support that type of legislation. So in raw numbers, certainly corporations have more money to wine and dine a legislator, but you are the only one who can elect them. So if your community says, I'm boycotting this, and I'm gonna make a huge stink about it, that's something fundamentally they have to listen up to more if they wanna keep their job. Because if you go door to door, if you raise enough noise in your community to say that this cannot continue to happen, you have a lot of influence there too.
Okay, I got a situation up here that I need to discuss. The thing is, lately, the international students in the St. Louis area has been experiencing a couple of problems regarding the immigration. As you know, day to day there have been new laws coming in, going out, so everybody's still confused about it. And recently, one of my friends got into a situation where police has stopped him and they had put him in jail for 24 hours without releasing any notice saying what was his crime. And after 24 hours, they left him out of the jail without any bond or something like that, just troubled him. Because of that, he has experienced mental issues. So I personally have suggested him and his family to go back home, because the way they have been treating the international students and a lot of immigrant people, because what is this newspaper, the local newspaper?
St. Louis Post-Dispatch?
No, the other
St.
one.
Louis American?
American.
No, the where they
Post-Dispatch?
where they'll post a lot of criminal things in
The World?
The World.
The world.
Where there was a column which has mentioned that the state has funded $600,000 to the ICE and FBI to remove the crime from the city, but I think they are taking their laws in their hand and taking advantage of their positions, I can say.
That was false imprisonment anyway.
I mean, he got so confused about the situation, like they even threatened him, calling the ICE saying that we're gonna deport you. And it's been a lot of pressure for a person who comes from a different country regarding a vision of just getting an education and going back to the country. Now he's having a wrong perspective again, sending somebody to the America. So what you would suggest me that I can help out other international students making an voice saying that, hey, so just if you get stopped by the police or somebody, just follow this so.
Yeah, so, I mean, the first resource to check out is there is a Know Your Rights when interacting with law enforcement ICE on the ACLU's website that you could definitely direct individuals to look at to sort of know their rights when stopped by ICE. From the perspective of like a lobbyist and changing the laws so that those situations are less likely to happen, one of the things that we've been very interested in with the Fourth Amendment Affirmation Act is making sure that law enforcement officials are not asking about immigration status, because that's really irrelevant to whether or not you were speeding. But it can have super pernicious effects for your immigration status within this country. Right now, in Missouri, law enforcement officials are not supposed to be asking for immigration status. However, they were under a previous guidance with the federal government. There was a funding grant, this is my understanding, there was a funding grant that would have allowed them to ask for that information. So I think many law enforcement actually have continued to do so, but I think there's an argument to be made that they shouldn't be asking in the first place. And so at a legislative angle, what we're trying to do is make it very explicit in the law what you can ask people when you stop them. This is also an issue that we advocated on when we were engaged in the electoral work around the McCullough-Bell race. One of the issues we wanted to be very sure of is that whoever won that race would make sure that if someone was being put in jail for a minor violation, that it wasn't going to immediately trigger an ICE detainer. Because just because there's been a minor crime or suspicion of a crime doesn't mean that you should be kicked out of the country. I know this fear because my husband is an immigrant, and he's very cavalier about getting stopped for speeding tickets, and it drives me nutty because I think of what it could do to his immigration status. And we're living in an environment where you have to be very cautious about those things. So I think your first instinct for the individual to learn their rights, definitely go to the ACLU National website, look at the encounters with ICE, know your rights, and disseminate that information. And then to the degree possible that people feel comfortable coming forward, we need more and more people to advocate, particularly in the realm of traffic stops. This is not something you should be asking for because it can damage families. And sharing stories is so important on that. I think I have time for just about one more question.
I got too many questions, y'all go ahead.
You can also shoot me an email after.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of related to the situation with his buddy or whatever. I thought the police was supposed to just ask you for driver's license and registration, not ask you whether you're an immigrant or whatever the case may be.
They do that.
I mean, I think it should be, well, I think the public should know the directives of the police and how they operate, because we don't know what they supposed to do or what not they supposed to do, you know what I mean? So, I mean, it's a big gap between the public and them. I'm like, and they get away with so much, you know, and we still trying to figure out how do we make them conform to what they took the job for, is protect people in the public.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge, we have to make policing transparent because the policing are supposed to serve people. They're supposed to serve us, right? To protect the communities they serve.
Right.
But so often, law enforcement, now I will say, for the benefit of the doubt for law enforcement, some of the regulations that they get are really confusing and it differs from locality to locality. That's why we need a state law to say, no, this is how we're going to do things. This is what constitutional policing looks like. And it shouldn't be that you're asking for all this additional information that might impinge someone's status. It shouldn't be that you're asking questions that could be construed as harassing. It should be very clear what you're there to do. And I think that one of the efforts that we have to make is to push for full transparency when it comes to law enforcement. There should be no gap between our understanding of what law enforcement can do and what law enforcement is doing. There should be no gap between what law enforcement should be doing and what law enforcement is doing. And that's one of the things that we have to continue to advocate on. But I think you're so right that one of the first steps is narrowing the gap when it comes to transparency and making sure that people know their rights and making sure that law enforcement recognize what their actual sort of directive is and what the law says about their, the constraints on their power. But it's really hard, particularly for communities that have been disempowered for generation after generation, to come forward and advocate for those changes when the effects of law enforcement who do not want those changes against individuals who advocate can be really devastating. You know, it's not unheard of for individuals to suddenly experience more traffic stops or be the subject of police surveillance. And those kind of things just shouldn't happen. And when they happen, particularly in the immigrant community and the Black and brown communities, it forces people to distance themselves even further out of fear. And that's not an environment we can continue to live in. And it's one of the reasons that everyone in this room and beyond has to advocate for change. Okay, everyone, I have got to go catch a flight. I am so sorry I could not be there in person. Is there anything else you want to go over? Feel free to email me. I will be in town on the 27th, if anyone, no, not on the 27th, on the 25th, if anyone wants to chat in person, but it was a real pleasure to get to speak to you all.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you. Catch that flight.
Thank you, have a good day.
You do the same.